Hey everyone, welcome back to the Deep Dive.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
All right, so today we're going deep on something that I think a lot of our listeners will find super fascinating.
Yeah, for sure.
And that is a new way to understand athletic training and performance adaptation
Mm-hmm.
using something called a three-dimensional impulse response model.
Right.
Three-dimensional impulse response
Yeah,
model.
it's a mouthful.
It is a mouthful. So what is that in a nutshell?
Yeah, so basically it looks at training load and performance, but through a different lens than we're used to.
Okay,
Like instead of just overall training load, it breaks it down by energy systems. So like,
okay.
the lactic system, the lactic system, and the aerobic system.
Right, so the different ways that our bodies fuel activity.
Exactly, yeah.
So instead of one number for training load, you have three different numbers.
Yeah, and it uses power data to model that too.
Okay, and where is all this coming from?
Yeah, so we're looking at a research paper called the Three-Dimensional Impulse Response Model, modeling the training process in accordance with energy system-specific adaptation.
Perfect. And so what's our mission today?
Well, we're going to try to unpack this new model and understand why it might be a more accurate way to look at training
Okay.
than the way we traditionally do it, and then,
Yeah,
how we might use that in our training.
perfect. So why do we even need a new model? Like what's wrong with the ways we track training and predict performance now?
Yeah, well, for a long time, we've tried to take this very complex thing that is training
Right.
and simplify it down to like one number.
Hmm.
And so, like the Bannister model, for example, it says performance is basically fitness minus fatigue.
Okay.
So it's this balance between the two.
Right. Fitness minus fatigue equals performance.
Right, exactly. Yeah.
But like where does that fall short?
Well, the problem is like, how do you actually measure that training load or that like stimulus or impulse?
Right.
And so traditional models have used a single metric to represent all the different types of stress you put on your body.
Oh, okay.
And that's the problem.
Yeah.
So like heart rate derived metrics like TRIMP,
Yeah, I've used that.
you get more points for being in a higher heart rate zone.
Right.
But heart rate doesn't always tell the whole story, right?
Yeah.
Like it can be influenced by other things like temperature and, just your mood.
Yeah.
And it doesn't always reflect the energy system usage perfectly. Like if you're doing short bursts or very long efforts or things with a lot of stopping and starting.
Right. Like heart rate is sort of a delayed response to effort as well.
Exactly.
Like
Yeah.
you start sprinting, your heart rate takes a little while to catch up.
Yeah, and there's research too, like the Vermeer study from 2021 that showed
Yeah.
that TRIMPs weren't really that consistently related to actual performance changes in cyclists.
Okay, so maybe heart rate isn't perfect. What about power?
Right.
What about power-based metrics like TSS?
Right. So TSS training stress score,
Yeah.
that's based on power meter data. And it takes your normalized power, which is kind of like a weighted average of your power output,
Right.
and it compares that to your functional threshold power, or FTP, which is kind of like
Okay.
your sustainable aerobic power.
Right.
And so an hour at FTP is 100 TSS.
Got it.
So it's a more direct measure of work than just heart rate.
Yeah, it seems like it would be a little bit better.
It is, yeah, but it's still limited because it's essentially one-dimensional.
Okay.
It assumes that adaptations you get are independent of the intensity.
So it doesn't matter if I'm going really hard for a short period of time or kind of cruising.
Exactly, yeah.
If the TSS is the same, the adaptation will be the same.
That's right, yeah.
Okay.
And that's not necessarily true.
Yeah, you wouldn't expect, walking to give you the same benefit as sprinting.
Yeah, and there's also another issue with how TSS estimate metabolic stress for efforts above FTP.
Okay.
So say you're doing a maximal 20-minute effort.
Right.
The TSS calculation for the first minute above FTP would be the same as for the 19th minute,
Okay.
even though your body's obviously under way more strain in that 19th minute.
Right. Your reserves are getting depleted.
Yeah, exactly.
And so your maximum power available
Right.
is going down.
Yeah, and so that's where this paper introduces this concept of a strain score, or SS,
Okay.
which is power-based, but it does take into account that time spent above that sustainable threshold.
Okay.
It's a little more nuanced.
So current models are trying to simplify things, but maybe they're oversimplifying things.
Right, yeah.
And so we're missing the nuance of how different types of training affect us differently.
Right, okay.
And so that leads us to the three dimensions of training load, right?
Right.
Like why three dimensions? Why not two? Why not that?
Well, the idea is that your body has three main energy systems that we talked about,
Right.
the lactic, and the aerobic.
Right.
And training at different intensities and durations is going to stress those systems differently
Right.
and lead to different adaptations.
Okay, so it's not just one engine, it's three different engines.
Exactly, yeah.
Okay. Can you give us some examples of how different types of training target these different engines?
Yeah, so think about very short sprint training, like 10-second all-out efforts with a long recovery.
Right.
That can improve your sprint speed, but it doesn't do much for your endurance.
Yeah.
Conversely, long, steady-state running mainly improves your aerobic capacity.
Yeah.
But then if you do something like high-intensity intervals, like repeated 30-second sprints,
Yeah.
that can actually improve both your aerobic and anaerobic capabilities.
Wow, interesting. So that's hitting both?
Yeah, because it's intense enough to really tap into all those systems.
Okay.
But if you're doing really, really short sprints, like just a few seconds,
Okay.
you might see very little improvement in your aerobic capacity.
Because you're not stressing it enough.
Exactly, yeah.
Okay, so we need to consider these systems separately
Yeah,
instead of a one-size-fits-all approach.
right.
We should be thinking about how our workouts are targeting each of these systems.
Exactly.
And so this model helps us do that.
Yeah, so instead of one overall fitness, it looks at the fitness of each of those three systems independently.
Okay, and so how do we do that? How do we measure that?
Right, so that's where those parameters from the three-parameter critical power model come in.
Okay, Pmax, CP, and W prime.
Right, those three values, they give us a snapshot of the capabilities of our three energy systems.
Okay, so those are the numbers that we need.
Yeah, so Pmax is your maximal sprint power.
Right.
And that represents the peak power your lactic system can produce.
Okay.
Your critical power CP, that represents your aerobic system's sustainable output.
Mm-hmm.
And then W prime is that reservoir of work you can do above CP,
Right.
which is mainly fueled by the lactic system.
Okay, so those are our three key numbers.
Yeah, and the 3CP model is actually an improvement on the old two-parameter model,
Okay.
which didn't have Pmax.
Okay.
So it assumed that you could just use W prime at an unlimited rate
Right.
for any duration, which isn't realistic.
Yeah.
So by adding Pmax, it gives us a more accurate picture,
Yeah.
especially for those high-power efforts.
Okay, cool. So how do we use this? How do we actually use this?
Yeah, so the model can actually use continuous power data
Okay.
to estimate how much each system is contributing to your power output at any given moment.
Okay.
So it breaks down your power into like components coming from Pmax, W prime, and CP.
So if I'm doing an all-out sprint, the model can say, okay,
Right,
X% of that is coming from a lactic.
right, exactly.
If I'm just kind of cruising, it's mostly aerobic.
Yeah.
What about those in-between efforts?
Right, so for those in-between efforts, all three systems contribute to some degree.
Okay.
And the paper gives an example, like if you have an athlete with a CP of 300 watts and a Pmax of 1,200 watts, an effort at 1,000 watts might have 544 watts coming from Pmax,
Okay.
156 watts coming from W prime,
Okay.
and then the remaining 300 watts coming from CP.
Okay, cool.
But then if that same athlete is riding at, say, 400 watts,
Yeah.
it might be 11 watts from Pmax, 89 watts from W prime, and 300 watts from CP.
Wow. Okay, so just shifting that intensity
Right.
really changes where that power is coming from.
Exactly. Yeah.
Interesting. Okay, so we have those moment-by-moment energy system contributions. How do we turn that into training load?
Right. So that's where the strain coefficient and strain rate come in.
Okay.
So the strain coefficient takes into account your proximity to your maximum power available, or MPA.
Okay, so MPA, that's like my ceiling
Right. Yeah.
of what I can do.
Exactly. And it changes based on how much W prime you've used up.
Right, because as I get more tired,
Right.
my ceiling comes down.
Exactly. So
Yeah,
the
yeah.
closer you are to your MPA, the higher the strain.
Right, so if I'm fresh and I'm doing, whatever, 300 watts,
Yeah.
that's not that big of a deal because I'm, I could do way more.
Right.
But if I'm, super fatigued and I could barely hold 300 watts,
Right.
the strain is much higher.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay.
And then the strain rate just multiplies that strain coefficient by your power output.
Okay.
And then to get a strain score for the whole workout, it just adds up all those second-by-second strain rates.
Okay.
And it normalizes that to your CP.
Okay.
So that like an hour at CP is roughly 100 strain score units,
Okay.
which makes it kind of comparable to TSS.
Right, like the same order of magnitude
Yeah, exactly.
of those numbers.
But the key difference is that this strain score can then be broken down into three parts.
Right.
SSP max, SSW prime, and SSCP,
Right.
which reflect the strain on each system.
Okay, so that's the three-dimensional part
Right, exactly.
of training load.
Yeah.
Cool. Okay, I'm getting it.
So the paper gives a good example, like Imagine exercising at CP when you're fresh versus exercising at CP when you've already depleted a lot of W prime.
Right.
When you're fresh, your MPA is high, so the strain is lower.
Right.
But when you're fatigued, your MPA is much lower.
Yeah.
So that same CP power output feels much harder.
Yeah.
And that's reflected in a higher strain score.
Okay, cool. So now we have these energy system specific strain scores.
Right.
How do we use them to actually predict performance gains or fatigue?
Yeah, so that's where the impulse response part of the model comes in.
Okay.
And it's similar to the traditional models that use fitness and fatigue,
Yeah.
but instead of one measure of each, it has three.
Right.
One for each energy system.
Okay.
So those three strain scores, SSCP, SSW prime, and SSP max,
Yeah.
they act as inputs for three separate impulse response models.
Okay.
So it's like running that fitness fatigue equation 3 times in parallel.
Interesting. So how does that actually work mathematically?
Right. So the standard one-dimensional model, like from Morton and colleagues,
Yeah.
it uses equations to describe how fitness and fatigue change over time in response to training.
Okay.
And those equations use weighting factors and time constants,
Okay.
which determine how quickly fitness and fatigue build up and decay.
Okay, so those could be individualized.
Yeah, and a lot of training platforms use something similar.
Yeah.
With exponentially weighted moving averages to
Right.
calculate things like chronic training load or CTL.
Yeah,
on
the blue line on the performance management chart,
Exactly, yeah.
and then ATL and TSB.
Right, so the 3D model does a similar thing,
Okay.
but it produces 3 separate performance management charts.
Yeah, okay.
One for each energy system.
Okay.
So you can really see how the fitness, fatigue, and performance of each system is evolving.
Okay. That's cool.
And figure 8 in the paper shows some real-world training data,
Okay.
visualized using both the traditional one-dimensional chart and this 3D model.
Yeah.
And you can see that CPW prime and Pmax don't always change in the same direction.
Wow. Interesting.
So you might be improving your endurance, but your sprint power is stagnating.
Right, or vice versa.
Exactly.
Wow. So you could be putting in a lot of work.
Right.
And overall, maybe your CTL is going up,
Yeah.
but you could be neglecting one of those systems.
Yeah, and the one-dimensional model wouldn't tell you that.
Right.
This gives you a more granular picture.
That's a really cool way to look at it.
Yeah.
So if we have these 3 separate impulse response models, does that mean that, like,
Right.
the weighting factors and the time constants, those are probably different for each system?
Yeah, exactly. That's the idea.
Right. Like you'd expect aerobic fitness to build and fade differently than sprint power.
Right. And there's not a ton of research on this yet, but it makes sense from what we know about exercise physiology
Okay.
and, practical experience.
Right. Like intuitively, it makes sense.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like we know that anaerobic performance can improve quickly with training,
Yeah.
but it can also decline pretty quickly if you stop doing that training.
Yeah.
Whereas aerobic fitness builds more slowly, but it's also more persistent.
Yeah. It hangs around a little longer.
Right. And, periodization strategies have kind of used this principle for a long time, like
Right.
building an aerobic base and then sharpening up speed and power.
Right. Building that base and then getting specific.
Right, exactly.
Right.
Yeah.
And so these time constants are probably different for everyone, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Training responsiveness is highly individual.
Right. Like some people respond to training really well.
Right.
Some people are kind of, hard gainers.
Yeah, and there's a lot of factors that go into the
Right. Genetics.
Yeah, genetics, your nutrition, your stress levels, yeah, all that stuff.
Okay.
And yet a lot of training platforms still use fixed time constants, like 42 days for fitness and 7 days for fatigue.
Right. For everybody.
For everybody, yeah. Which doesn't really make sense.
Right.
So ideally, you would individualize those parameters
Yeah.
through testing and observation.
Yeah. So this is all super promising, but are there any limitations to this model?
Yeah. I mean, no model is perfect, right?
Yeah.
It's not simplification of reality, and the researchers acknowledge that.
Okay.
So there are some assumptions.
Okay. What are the assumptions?
So like one assumption is that each energy system adapts in direct proportion to its contribution to the total energy used during training.
Okay.
Which makes sense, but we don't know for sure if that's perfectly true.
Right.
It also assumes that the adaptive process can be accurately described by those simple fitness and fatigue parameters.
Right.
And that the weighting factor for fitness gain is constant over time,
Okay.
which might not be true.
Right. Like we're always adapting and changing.
Right. And then there are some assumptions that are specific to this 3D model.
Okay. Yeah. What are those?
So one is that the contribution of each energy system can be accurately derived from just those 3 parameters.
Yeah. Pmax, CPW prime.
Yeah. but we don't have like perfect experimental validation of that yet.
Right.
And it also assumes that aerobic energy is immediately available at the start of exercise
Okay.
and that the supply rate from each system is constant,
Right.
which we know isn't exactly true because of things like oxygen uptake kinetics
Yeah.
and the delay in the glycolytic system.
Right.
And it also assumes that CPW prime and Pmax stay the same throughout an exercise session,
Okay.
which again isn't always the case.
Yeah.
So it's a simplification.
Right. So it's still a model.
Yeah.
So it's a simplification of reality,
Right.
but it seems like it's better.
Yeah. I mean, it's definitely an improvement over the one-dimensional models.
Yeah.
And the researchers say that more research is needed
Yeah, of course.
to really validate it.
Right.
But it's a good starting point.
Cool. Okay. So what's the main takeaway?
I think the main takeaway is that this model gives us a more nuanced, potentially more accurate way
Okay.
to understand how our bodies adapt to training.
Okay.
By looking at the specific demands on each energy system,
Right.
it moves beyond that single measure of training load.
So it's not just how much you train, but how you train.
Exactly. Yeah, and the quality of that training.
Right.
And by using these parameters from the power duration relationship,
Right.
it can quantify the strain on each system,
Okay.
and that can lead to more targeted and effective training.
Okay, cool. So we can actually use this to improve our training.
Yeah, I think so.
That's exciting.
Yeah, it's definitely a more sophisticated and interesting way to think about training.
Right. It's not just chasing one number.
Yeah,
It's really thinking about what am I trying to achieve?
right. And how do I get there?
Right.
Yeah.
So what do you think about this? How do you think this model could change the way people train?
Well, I think it could help people to understand how their bodies respond to different types of training.
Right.
Like what really stresses their sprint power versus their endurance versus their ability to repeat hard efforts.
Yeah.
And that could help them to be more specific with their training.
Right. And so you could maybe avoid overtraining.
Yeah, potentially.
Or undertraining a certain system.
Yeah, exactly.
That's super cool.
Yeah.
Well, I think this has been a super fascinating deep dive.
Yeah, I agree.
I really enjoyed learning about this new model.
Yeah, it's pretty cool.
And I hope our listeners did too.
Me too.
So for our listeners out there, I would challenge you to think about this.
Yeah.
When you're, doing your training.
Yeah.
What types of training do you intuitively feel
Yeah.
target these different systems?
Right.
And how can this new perspective maybe refine your instincts?
Yeah, it's food for thought.
It is food for thought. I think this is really a huge leap forward in training.
Yeah, I think so too.
So thanks for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
And we'll catch you next time on The Deep Dive.
All right, see ya.
Bye.